Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Western Flavors. Before we get into our new episode, let's recap the triumphant and emotional events from our last story. After months of a grueling legal and public relations war, the Bartlett Fleming family was finally vindicated. In a massive public ceremony, the Premier of Alberta apologized on behalf of the government, and in a powerful, cathartic moment, officially returned the restored deed to Heartland to its rightful patriarch, Jack Bartlett. The episode ended with the family, battered but unbroken, finally on the road home, their name cleared, and their land legally theirs once more. Now today, the celebration is over. As the dust settles, the family must confront the quiet and daunting reality of what comes next and the true cost of their hard-won victory. Victory has a sound. It is the roar of a crowd, the triumphant cry of a lawyer, the final beautiful clang of a prison door. But the morning after a victory has a sound all its own. It is a profound and heavy and unnerving silence. The adrenaline that had fueled the family for months, the single-minded focus of the fight, had evaporated with the morning mist, leaving behind a deep and cavernous and bone-weary exhaustion. The war was over, but the peace felt fragile and foreign and profoundly unsettling. The Dude Ranch Lodge, which had served as their war room and their sanctuary, was quiet. The sun streamed through the large windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. But the usual chaotic warmth of a Bartlett Fleming morning was absent. On the wide front porch, Jack sat in a rocking chair, a thick woolen blanket over his legs, his gaze fixed on the eastern horizon. He was not looking at the view, he was looking at the ghost of the one that was missing. In the office, the whiteboard was still a chaotic spiderweb of Nathan Price's corporate empire, a monument to a battle that had been won. Lou sat at the desk, a cold cup of coffee in her hand, staring at the board, not with a satisfaction, but with a blank and hollowed-out emptiness. The general, her war over, was a woman without a purpose. In their small, borrowed room, Ty and Amy lay awake on either side of their sleeping daughter. Lindy was a small and peaceful and blessedly ignorant anchor in the quiet storm of their thoughts. Ty watched the gentle rise and fall of her chest, his expression a mask of a fierce and protective love and a deep and abiding fear. He had saved them. But could he keep them safe in a world that now felt so irrevocably broken? Lisa was the one who tried to impose a sense of a normalcy on the quiet chaos. Her voice, when it called the family to the breakfast table, was a gentle and determined and slightly forced note of a cheer. "Breakfast is ready. Come on, everyone, before it gets cold." They gathered around the long, rustic dining table, a collection of weary soldiers trying to remember how to be a family at a peace. The conversation was a stilted and clumsy and painful thing. "Pass the salt, please, Tim."
Sure.
Does anyone want more coffee?
"I'm good, thanks, Lou." They talked about the weather, they talked about a lame horse in the Dude Ranch's stable, they talked about everything, and they talked about nothing. The single and most important subject, the 800-acre ruin of their own lives that lay just a few miles down the road, was a silent and monstrous ghost at the table. It was Lindy who, with the pure and innocent and devastating logic of a child, finally gave the ghost a name. She looked up from her plate of pancakes, her expression a mask of a simple and uncomplicated confusion. "Mommy, when are we going back to our real house?" The question, so simple, so honest, landed in the center of the table with the force of a physical blow. A profound and pained silence fell over the room. Every adult looked down at their plate, at their coffee mug, anywhere but at the small and questioning face of the little girl who had just and unknowingly and perfectly articulated the single and most daunting and most impossible question that was haunting them all. Amy opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. How did you explain to a child that her real house was now just a memory, a pile of a cold and wet ash? How did you explain that home was a thing they would have to rebuild, not just with a wood and a stone, but with the broken and shattered pieces of their own hearts? It was Jack who saved her. He reached out a long and weathered arm and placed his hand gently on Lindy's head.
We'll be going home soon, sweetie.
His voice was a low and quiet and deeply and weary rumble. He then looked up, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his battered and beautiful family.
We've won the war. Now we just have to figure out how to live with the peace.
Jack's quiet and heavy words settled over the breakfast table, a formal acknowledgement of the unspoken truth that had been haunting them all. The peace they now inhabited was not a destination. It was a new and unfamiliar and deeply challenging landscape they had to learn to navigate. The fragile attempt at a normal morning was over, the family scattering into the quiet corners of the lodge, each retreating into their own private world of a thought and a memory. The intrusion came just before lunch. A rental car, a generic and unassuming sedan, made its way up the drive. The family's collective nervous system, still finely tuned to the frequency of a threat, went on an instant and low-grade alert. But it was not an enemy. It was the journalist from the London paper, the one Lou had armed with the truth. His name was David Ashby, a man with a tired and cynical face, but with eyes that held a new and profound respect for the family he was now covering. Lou met him on the porch, a gatekeeper to her family's fragile peace.
David, I wasn't expecting you.
I know, and I'm sorry to intrude. My editor, well, the story has become a global phenomenon. The public is captivated. They see your family as a symbol of a resilience. They want to know what's next. He's asking for an exclusive, a follow-up, the first steps home. The request, though respectfully delivered, was a stark reminder of their new reality. They were no longer just a family. They were a story, a symbol. And the world, having consumed their tragedy, now demanded to consume their recovery as well.
I appreciate the offer, David, and we appreciate what you did. But it's too soon. We're not a story right now. We're just tired. We need time.
Her polite but firm refusal was an act of a pure and maternal protection. She was shielding her family from the relentless and consuming gaze of the very world she had so brilliantly used to save them. It was the first and most difficult cost of their victory, the loss of their own and quiet and private life. That cost became even clearer later that afternoon. The forced and public cheer of the ceremony was a distant memory, and the difficult and private work of a parenting in the aftermath had begun. Amy found Lindy in their small borrowed room, sitting on the floor, the sketch pad that had been her constant companion lying forgotten beside her. She was not crying, she was just staring at the wall, her small face a mask of a quiet and profound and deeply and unsettling sadness. Amy sat on the floor beside her, pulling her into a gentle and sideways hug.
What are you thinking about, sweetie?
Lindy was quiet for a long time, leaning her head against her mother's shoulder. When she finally spoke, her voice was a small and trembling and heartbreakingly logical whisper. If our house burned down, where did all my pictures go? The ones on the fridge? And what about my rocking horse? Grandpa made it for me. Is it Ash too? The questions were a series of a small and innocent and devastating daggers to Amy's heart. She had been so focused on the big and overwhelming loss, the loss of a home, of a safety, that she had not even considered the thousand and small and deeply and personal losses that were the true and brutal geography of a child's grief. She took a deep and steadying breath. She knew that a simple and easy lie would be a betrayal. She had to give her daughter the truth, as gently and as lovingly as she could.
Yes, honey. The fire, it took a lot of our things. The pictures and the rocking horse. They're gone now. And it's okay to be sad about that. It's okay to be really, really sad. I am too.
Lindy's small body began to tremble, the first and quiet tremors of a storm of a grief she had been holding back for days.
But the things, they're not what matters. The pictures are gone, but I will always remember every single one you ever drew for me. The rocking horse is gone, but the love that Grandpa put into it when he made it for you, that can't ever burn. It's in here.
She placed her hand over Lindy's small and rapidly beating heart.
And our house is gone, but that was just the wood and the stone. We are the home, sweetie. You and me and Daddy and Grandpa and Lou, we are Heartland, and we can build a new house, but we can't ever lose our home because we're all right here, together.
The dam of Lindy's carefully constructed and childish composure finally and completely broke. A deep and shuddering and heartbreaking sob was torn from her chest, and she turned and buried her face in her mother's arms, the full and crushing and terrible weight of her own and personal loss finally and blessedly released. Ty entered the room a moment later and saw them, a small and weeping and beautiful and heartbreaking island of a shared grief. He did not speak. He just knelt on the floor beside them and wrapped his own and strong and protective arms around them both. They were a family, huddled together in the quiet and safe and borrowed room, beginning the first and most daunting and most impossible and most important task of all, rebuilding not a ranch, but a little girl's entire and shattered sense of a home. The quiet and personal work of a healing was a solitary endeavor, but the men of the family, unaccustomed to an idleness, sought a refuge in the familiar and physical language of a ranch work. The day after the verdict, they were outside, the crisp and clean autumn air a welcome antidote to the stale and recycled air of the lodge. They were mending a long stretch of a fence on the far side of the Dude Ranch property, the rhythmic work a steady and grounding and welcome distraction. But the trauma they carried was not so easily left behind. It manifested in their movements. Caleb worked with a frantic and almost violent energy, his hammer blows against the wooden posts a series of sharp and percussive explosions. He was a man at war with the stillness, his body still humming with the caged and furious energy of his concrete cell. He was trying to sweat out the poison of his own helplessness. Scott Cardinal, in a stark contrast, was a quiet and withdrawn figure. He worked with a meticulous and almost detached precision, his movements economical, his gaze distant. He was physically present, but his mind was clearly still a prisoner in a place the others could not see. He was a man trying to impose a logical and orderly framework on a fundamentally chaotic and senseless experience. The fragile peace between their two and very different worlds was shattered by the sharp and splintering crack of a wood. Caleb had driven a fence post into the ground with such a force that the top of it had split clean in two. He let out a low and guttural and frustrated roar and threw the heavy mallet to the ground. "You're going to break that post, Caleb." Scott's voice was a quiet and clinical and detached observation, the voice of a veterinarian diagnosing a problem. Caleb spun on him, his own face a mask of a raw and defensive fury.
"You got a problem with how I'm working? You think you could do this better? What do you know about it anyway? You weren't in that concrete box. You don't know what it was like."
The accusation, born of a pain and a frustration, hung in the air. Scott did not flinch. He just looked at Caleb, his own eyes for the first time showing a flicker of a deep and profound and shared and terrible understanding. "You're right, Caleb. My box wasn't concrete." His voice was still quiet, but it was now infused with a chilling and almost academic weight. It was white, and it was silent. There were no sounds, no smells. The light was constant, a low and humming and fluorescent glare that never ever went out. They weren't trying to break my body. They were trying to erase my mind. It was a clinical and systematic sensory deprivation. After a few days, you start to lose the edges of it yourself. You forget what your own voice sounds like. The clinical and horrifying description of his own and very different kind of a hell silenced Caleb's rage instantly. He stared at Scott, at his friend, his brother-in-law, and for the first time, he saw the true and invisible and terrible scars of his own captivity, his own rage, his own physical suffering. It had been a clean and honest thing in a comparison. Scott's war had been a silent one, fought in the terrifying and empty landscape of his own consciousness. Caleb's anger dissolved, replaced by a wave of a profound and humbling and deeply and empathetic shame. He was not the only one who had been a prisoner. From the porch of the main lodge, Tim Fleming watched them, a deep and familiar and frustrating feeling of a helplessness churning in his own gut. He had not been captured. He had not been a prisoner. And in some and strange and twisted way that made his own guilt even heavier. He was the father. He was supposed to be the protector. And he had failed. Jack came and stood beside him, his own gaze following Tim's.
They're good men. They'll find their way back.
"I should have been there, Jack. I should have been with them. I should have seen Price for what he was from the beginning. A man supposed to protect his girls, his family, and I just stood by and watched while that snake slithered his way into our lives."
The confession was a raw and painful and deeply and vulnerable thing. It was the guilt of a man who had been a soldier his whole life and who felt that he had, in the most important battle of all, slept through his watch. Jack was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on the two and distant figures at the fence line.
You did protect them, Tim. You were here. You held this family together when I wasn't able to. You stood by Lou's side. You fought with her. You were her rock. That's a different kind of a fight. And you didn't back down from it. You never have.
The words were a small and quiet and necessary gift of a grace. They did not erase Tim's guilt, but they offered him a different and more generous story to tell himself. He just nodded, his throat too thick to speak, as he and the old man stood together in a shared and quiet and deeply and complicated silence, two patriarchs of a very different kinds, watching over the battered and beautiful and slowly and healing remnants of their own and beloved and broken family. The quiet and individual reckonings with the ghosts of their pasts had a unifying effect. By the end of the day, a new and unspoken consensus had settled over the family. They could no longer live in the borrowed and temporary world of the Dude Ranch, haunted by a ruin they had not truly faced. The healing could not begin in earnest until they had walked through the fire, until they had stood in the ashes of their own life. The decision was made without a formal discussion. It was a simple and quiet declaration from Jack at the dinner table.
Tomorrow morning, we go back. Together.
The following day, the family convoy made the short and silent journey from the Dude Ranch to the land that had once been their home. The mood was a stark and somber contrast to the triumphant return of the ceremony just a few days before. That had been a public victory. This was a private funeral. They pulled up at the main gate, the familiar and iconic arch with the word Heartland now gone, replaced by a temporary and metal gate that the RCMP had erected. They got out of their vehicles and stood in a line, a small and silent honor guard, looking at the devastation. The scale of it, the sheer and brutal totality of the destruction, was a thing that could not be comprehended from a distance. It was a physical and overwhelming and soul-crushing presence. The air was thick with the cold, an acrid scent of a wet ash and a charred pine. Where the vibrant and green and rolling lawn had once been was a black and muddy and barren wasteland. The great and ancient trees that had stood sentinel over the house for a century were now just skeletal and blackened and accusing, fingers clawing at the gray sky. The house, the beautiful and historic and living, breathing heart of their family, was a hollowed-out and skeletal ruin, its stone chimneys the only recognizable feature, rising into the sky like the lonely and forgotten tombstones of a life that was no more. The iconic and red barn was a collapsed and twisted and unrecognizable heap of a blackened timber and a warped metal. They walked through the gate, their boots crunching on the ashen ground, a procession of mourners entering a desecrated cathedral. They moved as if in a dream, each member of the family instinctively and silently drifting towards the ghost of the space that had meant the most to them. Lou walked to the footprint of her office, the place from which she had built her own and very different kind of a legacy. Amy moved as if drawn by a magnet towards the ruin of the barn, her own spiritual home. And Jack, his movements slow and heavy and deliberate, walked to the spot on the blackened earth where the front porch swing had once hung, the place where he had sat with his wife and his daughter and his granddaughters for a lifetime of a quiet and beautiful and now vanished evenings. They were a family of ghosts, walking through the skeleton of their own and murdered life. The sheer and daunting and impossible task of what came next was a weight that was beginning to settle on each of them in a different and conflicting way. Tim, a man who could only fight a chaos with an action, was the first to break the reverent silence. His voice was loud and jarring and practical, sound in the profound quiet of the ruin.
Okay. First things first, we need to get a crew in here with a bulldozer. Clear this mess out. We can have the foundation scraped clean by the end of the week. I'll call a contractor this afternoon. We need to get moving on the blueprints for the new house.
His words, meant to be a forward-thinking and practical solution, were a brutal intrusion on Amy's own and quiet and necessary grief.
No.
Her own voice was a sharp and pained and horrified cry.
No. We can't just scrape it all away. Not yet. There might be things left. Memories we have to look first. We have to...
Her voice trailed off. The idea of a bulldozer, of scraping their life away like so much trash, was a physical and violating thought. Lou, her mind already spinning with the logistical and financial nightmare of their new reality, saw a different problem entirely.
A contractor? Dad, have you lost your mind? Do you have any idea what this is going to cost? The insurance settlement is going to be a legal war in and of itself. It'll take months, maybe years, to see a fraction of that money. We can't just start building a new house. We have to have a plan, a budget.
So we're just supposed to let it sit here like this? A tombstone? For the whole world to come and gawk at? We have to do something.
The family, who had been so united in their fight against Nathan, was now, in the face of the daunting and impossible task of their own future, beginning to fracture. They stood in the center of the ruin, a small and grieving and deeply and loving family, pulling in three and very different and very painful directions. They were home, but they had never felt more lost. The raw and conflicting emotions of the family hung in the cold and smoky air, a fresh and painful wound in the heart of the ruin. The sheer and overwhelming scale of the destruction had shattered their fragile unity, the daunting, impossible task of rebuilding their lives from scratch, turning them against each other before they had even taken the first step. They were a family adrift in a sea of an ash, each trying to navigate the grief in their own and solitary way. It was Jack who, as he had done for a lifetime, became their lighthouse. He had been standing on the footprint of his front porch, a silent and heartbroken observer of the chaos. He finally turned from the ghost of his home and looked at his fractured and grieving family. His voice when he spoke was not loud, but it cut through the tense and angry and fearful silence with a quiet and absolute authority.
That's enough.
He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze a powerful and loving and deeply an understanding thing.
Your father is right, Lou. We can't just let this place sit here like a grave. But you're right, too. We can't afford to build a new house. Not yet. And Amy, you are more right than any of us. We cannot, and we will not, just scrape these memories away.
He walked, his movements slow and deliberate, through the debris, until he stood before them, a patriarch gathering his scattered flock.
Looking at all of this at once, it's too much. It's enough to break a person's spirit for good. We can't rebuild a house today, and we can't rebuild a barn. It's too big, and we're too tired.
He paused, letting the truth of his words settle over them, a quiet and shared and deeply and validating acknowledgement of their own and profound exhaustion. He then turned and pointed a long and weathered finger towards the road, towards the twisted and blackened and broken remains of what had once been their entrance.
But we can rebuild that. Before we lay a single new foundation, before we hammer a single new nail, we rebuild the gate. Heartland has always been a place you come home to, and the first thing you see, the thing that tells you you're safe, is that gate. It's the welcome. It's the promise. So before we do anything else, we rebuild the promise. We tell the world, and more important, we tell ourselves that our gate is open again.
The simple and profound and deeply and symbolic wisdom of his words was a balm. It was a single and manageable and beautiful first step in a journey that had seemed impossibly and terrifyingly long. It was a task that honored Tim's need for an action, Amy's need for a reverence, and Lou's need for a practicality. It was a task they could all do together. The rest of the afternoon was not spent in a grief or in an anger or in a fear. It was spent in a work. The family, a single and unified and purposeful unit once more, descended on the ruined entrance. The work was hard and slow and deeply and cathartic. They were not just clearing debris, they were reclaiming their home, one and broken piece at a time. Ty and Tim, their earlier and frustrated tension, now a silent and shared and productive energy, worked together, their movements a familiar and practiced and father and son rhythm. They measured and sawed a new and strong and beautiful length of a timber that a neighboring rancher, in a quiet act of a solidarity, had dropped off that morning. Lou and Peter, a silent and efficient team, cleared the scorched earth and the twisted metal, their shared work a quiet and healing conversation that needed no words. Jack, unable to do the heavy lifting, became the quiet and steady supervisor, his presence a constant and loving and deeply and necessary reminder of a why they were doing this. And he gave the most important job of all to Amy and to Lindy. He had found a single and long and miraculously an unburned plank of a smooth and beautiful pine.
Every gate needs a name.
Amy and Lindy sat on the tailgate of the truck, the clean and pale wood resting across their laps, and together they began the slow and patient and deeply and loving work of sanding it smooth. Victory was not the end of their war. It was the beginning of the long and quiet and difficult work of rebuilding a life. And a life, like a home, is not built all at once. It is built one day, one board, one single and hopeful step at a time. The episode ends on a final and quiet and beautiful and deeply and hopeful shot. A close-up of Lindy's small and determined hand, covered in a soot, guided by Amy's own and steady and loving one, as they work together, their movements a slow and rhythmic and patient dance, preparing the new and clean and beautiful and unbroken wood that would once again bear the single and most important and most powerful and most resilient word in their entire world, Heartland.